Welcome to another one of my inking videos. I wanted to show how I made my Hercules Wrongbones. Oh, there's my Gelato 290 nib close-ups. It's a steel nib that I'm using in this pen with an India ink, which I'll show you in the lower right now. So that's a pretty cheap version of my Dr. P.H. Martin's black India ink. The high carb Black Star. The Black Star is the version of Dr. P.H. Martin's that's really expensive. And I don't know that there's much of a difference between this and the cheaper Bombay black ink, so I use that usually because I order a ton of it at a time. Oh, that's this weird little sticky thing that I stick the ink bottle to. It's made for putting cell phones on dashboards, but I use it for my ink because you can pull it off and put it back on pretty easily, and it's harder to knock over. So I'm going to be quiet for most of this, but every once in a while I'll pop in and explain what's happening here. So especially in the beginning. So here is an image of a sketch that I did in my sketchbook that this is derived from, and that's the page that it's from. I pretty much develop everything in my sketchbook that I bind myself with my own specific anal retentive requirements. There's a close-up of the same page and the pencil that I use to draw everything. And yeah, so I first sort of invent everything in my sketchbook. That flower was also used in this image. Oh, so I took the sketch and the flower and I photoshopped it into a composition. So that flower is actually on there 3 times with sort of different positions and sizes and reverses and stuff, and then I made a composition that I liked, and then I projected it onto a larger piece of paper and lightly drew it in pencil, and then went over everything again in pencil to make everything so that it's like a guide for my ink pen. So I don't like to think too much when there's different kinds of thinking when it comes to making this stuff. One is the invention thinking, when you're just doodling around your sketchbook and you're coming up with new ideas and new things, and you don't care about composition, you're just doing stuff. Then you can look at that later and figure out, I want to use this from this page and this from this page, and play around in Photoshop and combine everything together. Oh, on the right is the finished ink drawing. It's 22 inches by 30 inches, which is sort of medium small for what I sometimes work in. I work up to 6 feet tall for some of these pen and ink drawings, but this is a pretty small one, especially since during this pandemic, I cannot get into my studio to work large, so I'm just forced to work on my kitchen table. So that's why it's this size. Perhaps someday I will make this larger, but for now, that's the size it is. So anyway, what I was saying about different brain modes. One brain mode is sketchbook mode, where you're sort of inventing and playing around, and you're not committed to anything. And so that's where you can come up with new ideas and not have to worry about anything. Then you can, when you want to make something larger, like a larger composition or a larger drawing, you can take those drawings and recomposite them into something new and different in a Photoshop document, where then you can project it and to any size you want. I have a cheap little crappy 7. I don't know what the resolution is. It's one below 1080p crappy projector I got for real cheap used, and I just plug. I make these Photoshop documents that I think of a composition that I'm gonna draw out of the sketchbook pages, and then I project it onto a larger piece of paper and just sort of trace that out. Yeah, so it's pretty planned out, I guess. But so the different brain modes are, sometimes I just don't feel like thinking about coming up with new ideas, and I don't have to as much when I'm doing this part of it. especially inking. I just want to think about the line and what's happening with the line and what makes sense spatially and visually. Like, will this line look like it's behind this line? A lot of it's don't smear it and don't touch the wet ink while it's working. So you sort of have to strategize, especially with a larger piece of paper. One side's drying while the other side's wet. I've gotten a little better at it, but I still smudge and smear every once in a while. If you look closely at the one on the right, I'll enlarge it at the end of the video so you can see it better, but you'll see some mistakes that I made as far as dripping and smudging. This one turned out pretty good. So yeah, that's the idea behind some of this stuff. You'll notice that when you use these pen and ink pens, these steel tip needle sharp point pens, you have to drag the nib. You can never push the nib or it will stick into the paper and you'll bend the nib and ink will splatter and fly everywhere and you'll ruin the nib. Every once in a while you'll get like a super powerful nib where it doesn't break, it doesn't bend, and after continual sessions where the ink has dried on the nib, you can scrape it off with a knife and keep drawing again and again. And this is, I got lucky with this one. Sometimes they last like 2 lines, sometimes they last a friggin' month. This might be one of those super nibs where, I mean, I take care of it, but even so, sometimes they don't last that long. This one lasted easily this whole drawing, and it was a used nib. I just picked it up and tried it out, which is pretty miraculous and lucky. They cost about $1 a piece, and I'll stop talking for a little while. So this, I'm about to show you the inking progress of this so far. You have to go over everything in first. Most of this video is me just going over for the first pass. So this is just the first pass. You can still see all the pencil lines behind everything, which I will have to erase. Once the ink is dry after the first pass of ink, you can, or I will, erase all the pencil lines behind it, and that will fade some of the black lines, but it doesn't matter because each black line gets at least 3 passes over every major line, so that it can make some thick and some thin. And as I mentioned in an earlier video last week, I think, each line I draw has 2 sides to it. One side is rough at first and the other side is smooth. So every time I draw a line, I want to make each side smooth. So I turn the paper the opposite 180 degrees so that I can make a smooth line on the other side of the line. It's just the nature of these pen nibs and how I prefer my lines to look. just noticed that I have a paper towel under my hand. My hands get really sweaty. My hands metabolize faster than the rest of my body for some reason, so they get real sweaty. I don't know if that's really metabolization, but that sweat will affect the paper. This is some pretty high quality watercolor paper that's sized externally and internally, which means there's like a glue type substance inside the paper so it doesn't fall apart when it gets wet, and on the outer surface of the paper so that it will hold watercolor where you put it. It doesn't bleed everywhere. The sweat in my hands, if I sit there and draw this for hours and hours, will soak into the paper and make it look a little different where I've rested my hand for a long period of time and sort of wetted the paper, so that when I it's invisible, but when I watercolor the paper later, the watercolor won't be as consistent and smooth in those areas. So I usually, it's not so much for smearing, but I use a paper towel or something underneath my hand while I'm drawing in order to prevent me from ruining the paper while I'm inking, so that when I watercolor it, it will be consistent. So this is the cooking type show phenomenon where you pull the casserole out of the oven and it's instantly done. Right here. So this is like sort of, I've gone over most of the lines 3 times that I want them to look a certain way, and now I'm drawing the petals of the flowers around Hercules here. I'm sort of improvising. It takes me a long time to warm up to figure out what the contour lines are going to be like. But once you start one, and you get going for a few, you can kind of keep improvising how you want it to look. It's kind of fun to do, a little stressful because you once you screw up with this ink, there's not that much you can do about it. But when there's a lot of lines like this, that it's a little bit easier to hide mistakes. So I'm just kind of figuring out, contours and spatial relationships between individual petals, and going off that. If I wasn't going to watercolor this, I would concentrate a lot more on the ink and make the push and pull for each object a little more extreme. But because I'm going to allow the color to do that later on, I'm not quite as careful or detail-oriented when it comes to these lines. Still, it's kind of while tedious, a fun exercise to kind of like fly by the seat of your pants and not have any pencil lines behind a lot of these internal contour, little sketchy lines in there. So to recap, I started with my sketchbook drawing, and then added another drawing from another page of my sketchbook. I, as the kids say, photoshopped it together into a composition that I liked, and then I projected it onto a bigger piece of paper, and then inked it up. And then the next stage in the next video will be watercoloring this guy. Hercules Wrongbones. Thanks for watching.